All right, greetings and welcome everyone to the very first webinar being offered by the International Jewish Collective for Justice in Palestine. This program is going to run for about an hour and 15 minutes, and just want to give you some quick housekeeping information. We are recording this program and we will share out the link to everyone who registered. And also please note that the chat is going to be disabled during the webinar, so if you have questions for the panelists, you can use the Q&A function to do that. We have an excellent program for you today, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about the organization that's hosting the program. First of all, my name is Leslie Williams, and I am active with Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States. And the program is being put on by the International Jewish Collective for Jews in Palestine, which is a group of Jews from 15 different countries. We're part of local, national, international networks and organizations, and we are connected by our involvement in the struggle for Palestinian rights and by our determination to work for justice for all peoples. We oppose Zionism and all forms of racism. Ijcjp was established in 2020 after 40 international Jewish organizations came together to condemn the anti-Palestinian International Holocaust Association definition of anti-Semitism, which claims to protect Jews, but is in fact being used to shield Israel from valid political challenges, to silence Palestinians, and suppress any discussion of Palestinian rights. We take this as our immediate priority, but it is only a starting point for our collective commitment to building a more just world. Through our monthly meetings, we seek to support each other, learn from each other, and bring in resources that help us all become more effective in advocating for Palestinian rights and against all forms of oppression from our separate corners of the world. As part of our educational mission, we wanted to highlight the experiences of selection of our members who have been doing transformative work advocating for Palestine. We expect that this will be only the first of several such discussions. Today's panel includes activists from Canada, Germany, South Africa, and New Zealand. I'm going to introduce the panelists briefly, and then we're going to have another member of our panel give us a little bit of context on why it was so important for this organization, excuse me, for this organization to come together. So I'm just going to go alphabetically by the name of the country. So first, I'd like to introduce Roland Gadette, who is a member of Independent Jewish Voices for Canada and conducts research for its No IHRA campaign, which launched in 2019. Great to have you here, Rowan. Next is Velen Hoban, who is chairman of the organization Jewish Voice for Just Peace in the Middle East, a German organization of Jews in support of Palestinian rights, which won the 2019 Göttingen Peace Prize for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Thanks so much for being with us, Velen. And Velen, I believe there was a quick plug you wanted to give for a program your group is doing.
That's right, not actually my group, but some comrades who have a documentary dealing with the defamation of pro-Palestinian activism in Germany. I'll just post the link. It's a film that has been on YouTube and can be requested for showing.
All right, great. Next, we have Rena King, who was an anti-apartheid activist in South Africa and is an active member of the Palestine Solidarity Movement through Stop the JNF, South African Jewish Voices for a Just Peace, and South African Jews for Free Palestine. Thanks so much for joining us, Rena. And finally, we have Marilyn Garson, who lives in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is the author of Still Lives, a memoir of Gaza. She's the co-founder of Shema Kolenu, Alternative Jewish Voices, a collective of non-Zionist Jews who challenge the Zionist monopoly over public Jewish speech in New Zealand, and who work in partnership with Palestinian-led efforts for a just future in Palestine, Israel. Thanks so much for joining us, Marilyn. Okay, but before we give our international panelists a series of questions, I'm going to introduce Brant Rosen, who's going to offer a few words to put today's program in context. Brant is a longtime advocate for Palestinian rights, and as a rabbi, he co-founded the Rabbinical Council of Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States, and he is the founding rabbi of the explicitly anti-Zionist synagogue, Tzedek Chicago. So welcome, Brant.
Thank you so much, Leslie. And thank you to Ijcjp for organizing today's program. I'm also very, very grateful to Donna Neville and Cheryl Nestle for their hard work in making this day possible. The prospect of building a worldwide Jewish movement of Palestine solidarity is truly an exciting one, an important one, and a very possible one. The very fact that we're having this program itself today is a sign that the time has come for a movement such as ours. And I'm honored to be part of this particular conversation today. We obviously have much territory to cover, so I don't want to speak for too long because we have some wonderful panelists to learn from. But as we move into our conversation, I'd just like to offer a few framing thoughts and questions from my vantage point as a Jewish Palestine activist based in the United States. On the one hand, it's remarkable to consider how far our movement has come in this country. The organization Jewish Voice for Peace has grown dramatically, providing a solid institutional home for Jews who work for justice in Palestine. We're also witnessing the growth of grassroots Jewish communities that offer safe and comfortable spiritual homes for non- and anti-Zionist Jews, where fealty to Israel and Zionism are not a requirement for participation. Perhaps more significantly, these kinds of Jewish spaces are growing outside of conventional Jewish communal structures. That is to say, we're carving out new territory that isn't dependent upon the so-called mainstream Jewish community for financial support or for validation. I'm aware, of course, that these kinds of new Jewish spaces are more common in larger cities than in some of the smaller Jewish communities around the US, or for that matter, around the world. To me, this points all the more to the need for an international movement such as this one. While our communities differ in many important ways from one another, we need each other. We need to carve out new Jewish space on an international level. We need to learn from one another. We need to inspire one another. I personally learned this lesson powerfully when we founded Tzedek Chicago 7 years ago. Almost from the very beginning, I received regular emails from Jewish individuals around the country and around the world asking me if there was a non- or anti-Zionist synagogue where they lived. No matter how different our communities may be, there is a very real and growing Jewish yearning for a Judaism beyond Zionism. And I just want to add that I think in some ways our congregation's experience can be kind of a microcosm for Ijcjp. When we started, we were a local Chicago community. When the pandemic struck over 2 years ago, we, like everybody else, went to online programs and services, and our membership changed very, very dramatically at that time. We are not just Tzedek Chicago anymore, although our core of membership is in this city, but we've gained very active members around the country and in fact around the world. And I think this points to not only the need and the yearning for creating this kind of community, but really the possibility in this day and age where we are discovering the possibilities of virtual community building. I think the time is really ripe for a network and a coalition such as Ijcjp. And I think it's a very exciting one for us as we explore the possibilities in our program today. Having said this, as we build this new international Jewish movement, there are common challenges we currently face no matter where we might happen to live. And I'd like to just offer a few, maybe a little more than a few. And this is by no means an exhaustive list, but these are the ones that I believe are quite critical for us. What does this Judaism look like beyond simply a rejection of Zionism? How do we create and celebrate this Judaism without decentering Palestinians and Palestinian oppression? How do we, or don't we, relate to the Jewish institutions in our local communities? What are our priorities for doing Palestine solidarity work as Jews, and how are they unique to the communities in which we live? Do our experiences of anti-Semitism differ depending on the countries in which we happen to live? How do we respond to the reality of anti-Semitism when we are often attacked as anti-Semites ourselves? How do we place our Jewish solidarity work with Palestinians within the larger movement for racial and social justice? Needless to say, we'll be discussing many of these questions at our program today. Like you, I look forward to learning from my friends and comrades. I know that our conversation will be generative in all the right ways, and that it will inspire us as we continue to do the sacred work of community building. And with that, I'd like now to hand things back over to Leslie.
All right, thank you, Brant. That was wonderful and gave us plenty of food for thought. Just want to point out that the chat is not disabled, and I see plenty of people have been greeting each other and offering their thanks and their congratulations from around the world. So we're just going to leave the chat open, and we're just going to trust that everybody behaves themselves appropriately and we don't have any trolls on the call. But so far, it's been a really loving series of greetings, and I'm really enjoying seeing how many people are here from so many different places. But let's dig into the questions that we have. We've got 3 main questions for each of the panelists, but we can, we've got some freedom to let this go in different directions, kind of depending on the conversation. So I'm going to ask each question of all 4 panelists first and give them a chance to respond to it, and then have a little back and forth, and then move on to the next couple of questions. And as I said before, I'm going in alphabetical order by country. So that'll be Roland, Wieland, Rena, and then Marilyn. So our first question is, what is your role in relation to the larger Jewish communities in your country? And of course, this touches on something that Brant brought up right at the end of his remarks. And what are the issues that gave rise to your organization, and how do you respond while modeling a Jewish life that's not based on nationalism or oppression or complicity in Palestinian oppression? So first I'm going to pass that to Roland.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So to start with the middle part, with how these issues gave rise to IJV. IJV was founded in a 2008 conference where essentially all these local groups, Jewish Palestine solidarity groups that were doing the same work, came together with the conclusion that by joining forces, they could form this kind of national organization that could function on a larger basis. And so we really have this root as a chapter-based organization that's to the core of where we come from. And right from the beginning, we found ourselves excluded from the mainstream Jewish community here in Canada, which for a time was ostensibly democratic under a thing called the Canadian Jewish Congress, which was then dissolved. And now the mainstream Jewish organizations on the national level are largely just political wings and pro-Israel lobby groups. And of course, they want nothing to do with us. So we've found ourselves continuously within this position of trying to push the balance on that and trying to effectively challenge them and hold them to account as they pretend to speak for all Jews in Canada, which obviously they don't. And so that's been our kind of relationship with the mainstream Jewish community in a way which really pushes the boundaries of what that means to be Jewish in Canada. And we've also found ourselves trying to build this Jewish life, especially on the chapter level, through things like now we have an online Chavurah, which speaks to the kind of Zoom Jewish life that Brant had mentioned, but even with local events, which we found, if we're even to take this very pragmatic activist perspective, even in this sense, these are very effective tools of mobilization, not to mention actually building that future of Judaism that we want. And I remember one meeting I was in where all these student activists realized that we'd actually been recruited to join IJV at the same Rosh Hashanah event. And so we find that these kind of moments are overlapping in both mobilizing Jews, especially young Jews, to get engaged on these topics, while also looking to build what are we actually looking to create and what are we actually looking to have as a community. And I'll leave that there because I've probably spoken too much already.
All right, great. That was wonderful. So Wieland, same question. Oh, still muted.
in terms of organic Jewish communities in Germany, the situation is quite difficult. I mean, the total number of people who identify as Jewish is 200,000, and only half of those are registered in any sense with a community or synagogue. And there's a constant battle really over who is supposed to speak or who is allowed to speak on behalf of Jews, what that means. And the community is somewhat fragmented in the sense that the homegrown community, obviously after the Holocaust, was almost wiped out, and some people came back gradually after that. But by far the largest part of the Jewish population came from the former Soviet Union in the 90s, mostly from Russia and Ukraine, and so now their children also growing up here. And so they don't actually have Holocaust experience in their families, but there is in Germany, the Holocaust constantly looms. And so there is this disproportionate association, one might say, of this terrible history with present communities as well. It's very difficult to get out of that. And that's also one of the things that makes the anti-Semitism debate so emotionalized and polarized, because, you know, ideally all forms of racist discrimination and violence should be treated as equally important. But when you have anti-Semitism as the one form which in this country led to millions of people being murdered, then this is somehow treated even today as more severe. And of course, you know, whatever the background of a person who is attacked or discriminated should be treated with equal importance. And there's an increasingly large Israeli population, mostly in Berlin. And actually our group was founded by a handful of mostly Israelis who came, well, mostly for political reasons. They basically couldn't take the kind of Zionist society they were brought up in. And some of them had a rather rude awakening when they found themselves then facing Germans who essentially were making the same arguments as Israeli right-wingers, because the way in which Germans often process Holocaust guilt is a disproportionate support of Israel. And so, you know, they'll even go so far as to lecture Israeli Jews about not supporting Israel enough. So it's a minefield, really. And it's difficult to find allies, and yeah, one just has to see who is open to these kinds of connections. But we tend to be marginalized.
Yeah, and I'm sure most of us know about what went on this past week after the murder of Shireen and your attempts to do vigils in Germany, which were essentially outlawed, correct?
That's right, because there was a blanket ban over the Nakba weekend on all sort of events or demonstrations or anything that could be subsumed under that category relating to Nakba. So even though the vigil was not about the Nakba, they said, okay, you know, this falls into this space of time, and clearly it's a pro-Palestinian, so the same applies to this, which really just made explicit how anti-Palestinian the motivation behind this was. And if one behind the scenes found some of the police statements and legal opinions about the reasoning for this ban, there's also reference to the danger of these highly emotional communities and you know, their proclivities towards possible violence. Yeah.
Yeah. So, of course, South Africa is also a country that has a very fraught history with institutional official racism. So, Rena, what has your experience been?
So, a funny incident happened within South African Jewish community, and the Jewish community tried to make out that they were proud of anti-apartheid activists. And trust me that the mainstream Jewish community alienated us during apartheid years. But now they're promoting this book called Mentors in the Trenches, Jewish Foot Soldiers in the Anti-Apartheid Struggle, which excludes most Jewish ANC people, especially excluding anyone who is critical of Israel. Only people who are now pro-Israel are included. So their launch announcement of the book to take place in Ra'anana, historical Palestine, looks like this. Can everybody see that? So what is very funny is that they say that Wendy Kahn and Zev Krengel will pay tribute to Jewish South Africans who made a contribution to the anti-Israel struggle in South Africa. So this is the Jewish Board of Deputies who made this Freudian slip, much like Bush's Freudian slip that said that one man destroyed Iraq instead of saying, well, and they soon changed this, but Zev Krengel proudly announced in 2010 that he was responsible for, he facilitated efforts to ban Judge Richard Goldstone from his grandson's bar mitzvah. Richard Goldstone led a UN-backed investigation which found that Israel deliberately targets civilians and was ostracized to the point that he withdrew his findings. I mean, having said this, although the mainstream Jewish community does not support, has not supported progressive South Africa, South African Jews have been disproportionately represented in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, and mostly not acknowledged by the Jewish community. Our current organization, Ijcjp, emerged from organizations around opposing the JNF in South Africa and exposing the greenwashing, emerging from a film made by one of our comrades, Village Under the Forest, which was a film about the South African forest, how we were duped into buying trees under the JNF that was planted over the Lubya village. And we organized a ceremony to hand over 250 certificates signed by South African Jews, recognizing our complicity in the planting of trees over the village and acknowledging the lies fed to us as children. We had the ceremony with people from Lubya who were internally displaced as well as exiled people. So relationship with the people of Lubya has continued, and we have a forest planted at our constitutional hill called the Palestinian Nakba Forest.
Okay, so Rita, I'd like to get into that a little later, but I also want to move on to Marilyn, and then we can maybe get back to more details about your story. So thanks so much. So Marilyn, what about the relationship with the Jewish community in New Zealand?
Good morning. My little group is an outlier among the big activist groups, but we may be more typical of small and remote communities. There are about 7,000 Jews in New Zealand, and before we were established, there was only one intermittent Jewish anti-occupation organization. All of our institutions are explicitly Zionist, and our institutions appoint the National Jewish Council. 2 years ago, 5 of us, we are now 8, we formed a little collective. We wanted a platform to say that there are many ways to be a Jew, and we are not Zionist. We came together to publicly challenge the Zionist claim to a monopoly over Judaism. Judaism has been a plural noun for 2,000 years. And we wanted to say that when you don't place nationalism at the heart of your Jewish identity, you do more than just give up the cognitive dissonance of the Israeli exception. You open up a big expansive space. And we wanted to show that space as being filled by religion, culture, ethics, music. So we do not occupy one niche. We are Orthodox and progressive. We are religious and secular. We are the not Zionist breadth. And we bring that breadth to our work for a just future for everyone in Palestine and Israel. We just keep saying, when you think of our Jewish community, assume our diversity. Our Hebrew name is Shema Kolenu, hear our voices, and we believe our message is being heard within the community and increasingly in the media, by government, and by our neighbors who have only been hearing from this castigating Zionist voice. Several of us are also personally determined to enact a Jewish religious practice that is consistent with our anti-Zionism. We meet lots of young and unaffiliated Jews who feel excluded. They believe that they will have to choose between their religion and their principles. And we want to show that Judaism and justice belong together. We in Wellington now worship at an independent minyan a couple of times a week, in order that we can pray without those limitations. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Marilyn. Also just want to add, there was a question in the Q&A about transcripts. And if you click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to generate subtitles for the conversation. So I apologize for not mentioning that earlier. So I think from the questions we've seen, just the variety of experiences that our organizations have, and organizations that have in countries that have very large, very active Jewish communities, the special circumstances in Germany, where I think Germany has officially said that they feel they have a special obligation to protect Israel and to protect Israeli Jews, to countries where the Jewish community is very diverse and perhaps very scattered. So I wanted to bring it back around to the question of Palestinians and how, given these very different ecosystems that you're all in, how Palestinian advocacy is seen or works in your countries. Is it mostly through political organizing, for example, supporting candidates and changing political policies, or more grassroots? And how you develop the organizational priorities in your context, and if this group, being part of Ijcjp, has been able to help you with that. So once again, we'll start with Roland.
Yes. I mean, like I said, we're this kind of interesting mix between national and grassroots. And I think that there's a very productive tension that comes with that, trying to do both at the same time, which is what we do. We try to do the political advocacy while also doing the local grassroots activism. And in terms of our organizational priorities, I think it largely comes in collaboration with our non-Jewish allies in the movement and seeing where we can be most effective. And so one of the main things that we've been doing for the last several years is the No IHRA campaign against the IHRA definition, because that was something that we saw, this is something unique where our position as Jewish advocates can really make a difference that other people can't. And even individuals who have very thoughtful and well-known critiques would obviously, when they're not Jewish, would obviously prefer to be making these critiques of an anti-Semitism definition alongside Jewish partners. And so that's a role that we've really stepped into and have seen kind of as something crucial for us to do, and something that it really falls to us to do. And I think in terms of the last part of your question about what has come with this group, I think it's been a really wonderful space for sounding boards and inspiration, but also when we've tried to get rapid responses and open letters signed, that we've seen a lot of these things. And I also think that that question is answered in some part by the responses that we had to the first question, when we all said that we're quite isolated as Jewish organizations in our respective countries. And I think my experience with Ijcjp, especially being a younger Jewish activist, has really been an experience of breaking that isolation and seeing people who have different organizing contexts, maybe different organizations and different fights that they're fighting, but nonetheless are both Jewish and, principally speaking, aligned with us, has been a really heartening experience. And I think that's been one of the most powerful things that I've gotten out of this, at least.
Great, thank you. So Wieland, how about in Germany, connection with Palestinian advocacy?
It's very much more of a grassroots thing, because it's hard to find Palestinian background people who have somehow entered the system of public life in such a way as to enable a kind of political foothold. And it seems that every time someone from a Palestinian background becomes more well known or in the news, it's immediately in connection with accusations of anti-Semitism. If they have the audacity to somehow bring up their background and to say, well, it's all very well what you say about Israel, but my family had some somewhat different experiences. Maybe in 1948 they were driven out of Palestine, for example. Those things are very unwelcome in the discourse, and one has seen also press campaigns, media campaigns against, for example, last year a journalist, Naimi Al-Hassan, who was fired, and many things like this. It's become a real pattern, and so one has to find a grassroots way, and there's certainly no shortage of people who can be part of that. I mean, in Berlin, there are at least 30,000 Palestinians. I mean, I say Palestinians from different kinds of backgrounds. So whether they're, from the West Bank or Gaza or Israel, or came via Lebanon or Syria. So for example, the refugee waves from the Syrian war included also actually a lot of Palestinians from camps like Yarmouk. So there are a lot of people to work with, but there's also this constant demonization and marginalization to work against. And so there has to be a certain willingness among those people to really put themselves in the line of fire. It's difficult for them to really be active in a visible way without immediately being in a position of, being exposed to a lot of hostility. So that's something that, again, is an uphill battle, and it's not easy to find reliable allies who will assist them. I mean, so that's an important task for us to just really try to amplify and support them. And being part of this alliance, Ijcjp, every meeting is just incredibly instructive, seeing how all across the world people are dealing with this. Also, communities of very different sizes. So obviously in America you have between 6 and 7 million Jews, something that's completely unimaginable here. And so accordingly, you can also really mobilize large numbers, for the cause. JVP and also IJV, they have very big groups, but then in New Zealand, then it's very small. It goes through the whole range, and so we see really just the different scales of operating, which I think can always give us new ideas. And of course, we're dealing with a lot of very experienced activists here. I'm not one of them, but I'm all the more happy to profit from their wisdom.
Great, glad to hear it.
And of course, the reach that one gets, because which should be clear to the viewers also, that although each of us is just like one member for a country, we're of course representing organizations respectively, you know, so there's a lot more of us in effect, you know, so then this has enabled just far greater possibilities for networking and for like getting quick access to different activist groups that we wouldn't so easily have otherwise.
Yes, and I should mention that there have been times when all of us as an organization have signed on to statements supporting academics who were having their positions threatened or taking stances. I remember there was a conference of mayors in Europe that were all going to pass the Ijcjp definition, and we kind of as a group expressed our opposition to that. So Rena, what about the situation in South Africa in terms of Palestinian solidarity?
So historically in South Africa, political organization is grassroots based, and Palestinian advocacy grassroots organizations are primarily situated within the Muslim community, trade unions, progressive church, and re-emerging progressive community organization. Ijcjp is a home for anti-Zionist Jews, and we integrate into those organizations, and we're important in adding a Jewish element. Advocacy is done through these organizations, as well as trying to influence political organizations. So for example, handing a memorandum to our Department of International Relations was part of a rally, which various speakers spoke at, and I spoke representing Ijcjp. We an active part of the South African BDS coalition, which is very vilified by the Jewish community. And if we take on a boycott, we ensure that the trade union is on board. So we often invited to be part of other organizations' presentations. Just as a small group of whites, mostly Jews, were active in the anti-apartheid struggle in the 50s, so our Jewish organization is part of the broader Palestinian struggle. So although the ANC is supportive of the Palestinian struggle and has a strong historical relationship with the Palestinian cause, the relationship in government is ambiguous, with the affluent and influential Jewish community lobbying the government officials and watering down militancies. So it is important for us to put pressure on the government to maintain a stance that's pro-Palestinian and anti-apartheid Israel.
Okay, excellent, thank you. And finally, Marilyn.
As a little collective, we need to situate ourselves where a pen, a blog, can have some impact. We take on 3 issues. We lead in challenging the unelected and intolerant voices that have been representing our community. Second, we and others have thus far prevented the IHRA definition from gaining any official standing anywhere in this country. Long may that last. We've taken on the job of creating resources for officials, for groups and individuals, and we rely on our neighbors that way to see the dangers of the IHRA and continue to reject it. We also try to provoke our fellow Jews to think about a more meaningful Jewish anti-racism, to see ourselves as agents and sometimes beneficiaries, as well as victims of racial structures. And of course, we support Palestinian initiatives for liberation. We do that as publicly as possible and also by building political relationships together. I have to say, when members of the Ijcjp first contacted me, I sort of deflected the email because I thought it wouldn't be very relevant to us. But it has turned out to be important and relevant. As a very small group, we get to preview, to learn from and adapt strategies that have been developed with resources we will never match. We walk into a global network that we would never build in our own names. And as well, when you stand up in a small community, it's different. We began with 2 people standing up in a small city. And if anyone had told me in advance how personal that would be, I think I might have just gone back to bed. I have really needed to be in the company of other people who walk into this vortex. And at times I have quite frankly brought them my fears. And consistently, Sarah Roy, Rabbi Rosen and Tzedek Chicago and members of this group have just accompanied me down a road that I really didn't intend to take. I think that's important to say because I believe there will be lots of other Jews in small communities who might stand up if they understood the quality of support and solidarity that they would find. Thanks. No, thank you. That's better.
So I also wanted to give Brant a bit of a crack at this one because I know this is something that we've discussed a lot.
Thanks. And thank you, Marilyn, for that. Yeah, just briefly, because I know we want to move along, but I just wanted to add that here in the US, I think we're going to be seeing we are seeing and will be seeing a much greater gearing up on the political advocacy front. A few years ago, Jewish Voice for Peace started their 501c4 Jewish JVP action. So now that there is this opportunity to endorse candidates, and we're in a time now where we have a Palestinian American congressperson who has just introduced, for instance, a resolution in Congress recognizing the Nakba. So this would have been unheard of a few years ago. And on the other side of things, the AIPAC and an organization or lobbying organization called the Democratic Majority for Israel is throwing millions and millions of dollars into campaigns of pro-Israel and Zionist candidates, but often under the guise of attacking progressive Democrats. So we just saw in Pennsylvania, for instance, Summer Lee was up against millions and millions of dollars of sliming, and she was able to eke out a victory there. But I think because of this, we're going to see more political advocacy on the Palestine solidarity front, because it's just going to be a necessity, and not to the exclusion of grassroots organizing, which obviously can and should continue.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that case up with AIPAC and Summerlee, because this ties into 2 questions we've gotten in the Q&A. One was exactly that question: how much do the financial contributions of Zionist organizations like AIPAC affect your movement work in your different countries? And have you been successful at getting Jewish and Palestinian groups to work together for Palestinian rights? And I know this wasn't one of the questions we previewed, so I can kind of make this a popcorn one for the rest of our panelists. So influence of Zionist organizations, particularly financial contributions, and the ability to get Jewish and Palestinian groups to work together.
Am I up first again?
Sure.
Sure. So Canada actually doesn't have as democratic laws around financial contributions to political campaigns as the US does. So we have no way of getting concrete numbers on the amount of money that is being put in by Zionist organizations. We can obviously guess, and we can guess that it's quite high by Canadian standards, but we don't actually have any numbers to base that off of. That said, in general, we are drastically outgunned financially compared to the other organizations here in Canada. And it's reasonable to assume that extends into the kind of political lobbying work that's happening. And so I think that is a reality, even if we can't really find the numbers anywhere. to prove or disprove it. And to the second point around working with Palestinian groups, we've been quite successful, both with kind of lobbying groups that are Palestinian based here in Canada that work on that political advocacy, as well as the Palestinian youth movement, who've become a really important and powerful grassroots ally here in Canada. And I know they're also active elsewhere as well. And so we've seen that take place, as well as other local groups within kind of chapter or city or province contexts. And we've been really lucky to have some really strong and courageous Palestinian allies to work alongside us.
All right, great. Wieland, what about in Germany, both influence of Zionist organizations and Zionist money and Palestinian and Jewish groups working in tandem?
Well, in terms of using money as influence, I mean, in Germany, you don't have anything like the kind of donor structures that you have in the US, where you can more or less buy candidates. That's far more restricted here. And there isn't a lot of money in that sense going around, but what of course happens is that the budgets that are there, they are allocated then to organizations with a certain kind of profile, a certain respectability, which tend to be working against anti-Semitism, which usually means also to some degree pro-Israel, and also just taking any kind of sort of anti-Zionist leanings as one of the things that falls under anti-Semitism. And so therefore you have the whole kind of educational approach also that is skewed in this direction. So then if you have organizations, say anti-discrimination organizations that are getting funding, it's not Zionist money in that sense, but they're getting public funding, and maybe some of them actually do very good work in other areas of anti-discrimination, when it comes to refugee rights, for example. But when it comes to Israel, then they're likely to be demonizing Palestinians and loudly condemning BDS and really spreading the message that if you want to be part of this kind of anti-discrimination civic struggle, then you also have to join them in supporting Israel. So that's a really unfortunate contradiction, because then it also means that you have to, in a sense, be at war with organizations whose other activities, you would actually welcome. And the other aspect, Palestinian organizations, I mean, they're few and far between here. And also Jewish organizations that are somehow politically active are also, I mean, leaving aside the fact that Zionism is, a political stance, okay, in that sense, a lot of the organizations are, but in terms of some sort of grassroots activism, no. I mean, generally, if Jewish groups are supporting some kind of initiatives to do with politics, then it's about raising awareness about anti-Semitism, etc. And so the same logic goes towards Zionism. That's always the direction it takes. So so education is actually, or miseducation is you might say the bigger problem than money, which is sort of deforming a political landscape. It's more the knowledge that's being deformed.
Yeah, I like that term, miseducation. That might be something that we want to come back to. So Rena, what about in the South African context in terms of influence of Zionist organizations, but also Palestinian and Jewish solidarity?
So certainly the Zionists do woo and political people and people in government. They, the opposition party, the Democratic Alliance, is pretty pro-Zionist, and they are taken over to Israel quite often. And as I said, the South African Jewish community also has disproportionate wealth in South Africa. And so their businesses and their are seen as important for the country. They had a meeting with our president, although I am sure that he has told them that he is not going to support an apartheid Israel. There's ambiguity, and he will not cross the Jewish board. In terms of Palestinian organization, it's very integrated in South Africa, and we have a lot of interactions. The Palestinian embassy kind of comes to our rallies, and which is a bit uncomfortable, but yeah, we have a very grassroots Palestinian grouping. Not a lot of Palestinians in South Africa. Palestinians still have to get a visa to come into South Africa, where Israelis do not, which is part of our memorandum to the International Affairs.
Okay. And Marilyn, what about in New Zealand?
Until very recently, New Zealand has heard a lot of non-Palestinians speaking about Palestinians. And our partner group is really on the forefront of seeing that change, letting that change. There's a whole next generation set of Palestinians who are taking their dialogue back. And we love to work with them. I've spoken in support of them in Parliament. It's just terrific to see. I think the influence here plays out differently, and it's well illustrated by what happened in the past week. A week ago, Wellington became one of 2 cities in the world to ban Palestinian display, in this case, a display of Palestinian colors, on Nakba Day, specifically because, and I quote, advice from our Foreign Affairs Ministry, it might provoke complaints from the Israeli ambassador or other Israeli groups, period. A week later, having not defined what that meant, we see images of a new Israeli trade-focused consulate opening up in Auckland with at least one national politician present at the opening. So we see more of an old club than a big ostensible financial issue.
Interesting. So I'm going to get to our third question, but I'm also going to mention a few things that have come up in the chat just to give you guys a chance to think about that. And one of these really seems like it's almost tailored to Brant, actually, which is it important to promote diasporism? So the idea of a positive vision of Jewish life apart from Zionism in our work. And also, this I think ties a little bit into the last question, but also the next one I'm going to ask is, how do we avoid centering ourselves and centering the Jewish community in these discussions? And I think we see this on both sides of the question, really. A lot of Jewish movements for Palestine that talk about transforming or reforming the Jewish community as opposed to really focusing on Palestinian rights. So, in your countries, we've talked about Palestinian advocacy, but how does this fit into larger organizing for human rights and other movements for racial and social justice? And also, have there ever been any conflicts between your progressive organizing and your organizing for Palestine? And a couple people have already mentioned that sometimes people who seem to be on the right side on every other issue become our opposition when it comes to dealing with Palestine. So again, I'll start with Rowan.
Sure. I mean, I think to the question of centering ourselves is a really good one. And I kind of, one of those questions that you can't have a perfect answer to. I think it's kind of something that you constantly have to be aware of. There's no solution, there's no done for the day on this one, but I think it's important to keep mind on what conversations you're in the middle of. when you're talking about, I brought up the example earlier of the IHRA, well, maybe it is actually strategically useful that we're slightly more centered compared to talking about, say, experiences in Palestine, where obviously our voices shouldn't be as centered. And so I think keeping mind of the specific circumstances that you're under is a really important one. But also I think that there's a tool to almost contradict myself. There's a certain rerouting of conversation that you can do when the conversation starts shifting to bring it back to Palestinian narratives, Palestinian experiences. And that is almost a strategic tool that can be used even in something like IHRA debates, where the claim that calling Israel a racist state is anti-Semitic kind of falls apart in of itself when you look at Palestinian lived experience. And so simply amplifying Palestinian voices there is a almost strategic argumentative tool in very kind of pragmatic mindset. And of course, working with Palestinian allies is the best way to do it in a local kind of Canadian context or city context. And I think that comes down to a lot of our work within the Palestinian movement. And then of course, in Canada, we're also on Indigenous land. And so one of our other main priorities is Indigenous solidarity, which is one where we kind of practice a bit more of that, not centering ourselves, because there's very rarely, if ever, a situation where it would be appropriate to do so. And so I think that, again, it's that kind of consciousness of thinking through the specific conversation that you're in or the specific topic you're working on. And yeah, I think the old progressive that said Palestine cliche is maybe something that still rings true, although it seems to be less and less possible, at least in Canada, or at least when it does rise, it seems to be called out a little more, which is promising, but it's still around and doesn't seem to be going anywhere.
Okay. So Velan, and first Velan, I think you wanted to restate something else you'd said earlier before we get to this next question.
Yeah, just I realized that I'd perhaps given the impression that like there aren't any Palestinian organizations around here that one could work with. That's not the case. It's just that they're very much marginalized and silenced, and especially the orchestrated anti-BDS campaign coming from regional governments, NGOs, media has made it in a very literal way. Like, for example, just like renting a space in order to have some sort of event made it extremely difficult, and that's hit a lot of these very hard. And then also there's some generational complexities where some of actually what Marilyn also was saying about this younger generation who are now often more loud and passionate and also very articulate in ways that sometimes put them at odds with the generation of their parents, who maybe were the ones who actually came as immigrants and were just a lot more careful about what they said and about endangering their status, and also maybe cling more to old paradigms about what one can aim for in Palestine, so 2 states, 1 state. This is something that can sometimes complicate activism. I mean, we all know that the left has a tendency to eat itself over detailed disagreements. So yeah, that's one thing that has to be looked out for. I think the question about centering ourselves is very important, because in a sense, our angle here as organizations, I mean, all of us, to an extent, our whole sort of raison d'etre is centering ourselves, because we're saying, hello, we're Jews and we support Palestine. It's not only other people and anti-Semites, etc. I mean, just conceptually, right? The message is that there are other reasons for doing this, and there are also reasons that tie into Jewish traditions of ethics and also diasporism, as was mentioned in the Q&A, which I think is very important, because diasporism is the literal opposite of nationalism, and nationalism is precisely what makes Zionism so destructive. So getting back to a kind of diasporic identity, I think, is something that can only be beneficial, really. I mean, but in any case, I think that with centering versus decentering, it's to do with who's allowed to speak, because, you know, in some argument, then you'll come along and say, well, no, actually, from a Jewish perspective, we think that it's very important to speak about Palestinian rights, right? You kind of have to use this as your entry ticket. And that, of course, then creates a danger that this turned into a Jewish discussion. And like, before Palestinians can even tell a story, they're already expected to prove that they're not anti-Semitic. So this is constantly being put in the way. It's this constant obstacle, right? So that even when we're not trying to make it about us, someone is, because just in terms of the whole discursive landscape, people can't imagine Palestinian life without the lens of anti-Semitism. You know, it's so difficult for them to think of just people in a place on their land experiencing brutal injustice, and therefore people wanting to support that, right? For them, a Palestinian only exists in an antithetical kind of relationship to Jews, which is tragic and extremely harmful.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's also something that's, I think, a clear target. I think it gives us something to work with in terms of the kind of information we want to disseminate, the kinds of argumentation we want to use, and seeing also sometimes now the intersections between other anti-racism and pro-Palestinian positions, which is unfortunately something more in the US. Obviously, the movement for Black Lives has been very vocal in support of Palestine, whereas here, some people still have a tendency to see that as a kind of blind spot of anti-racists who are somehow duped into supporting anti-Semitic causes. But, you know, I just hope that with younger generations, that more people are going to go in that direction, to really just see the commonalities between these different anti-racist and anti-discrimination struggles.
Yeah, yeah. So Rina, so just again, the questions at this point were Palestinian advocacy and other forms of anti-racism, which I think you talked about a little bit with South Africa. There was also a specific question for you about the Palestinian embassy in South Africa, and if you know anything about how that was established.
So let me start with that. The ANC and the PLO have a long-standing relationship, and basically the Palestinians were invited by the government to set up an embassy, and they did. So we have a Palestinian embassy in South Africa, as well as an Israeli embassy, but we don't have a South African ambassador in Israel. We have withdrawn our South African ambassador from Israel. So as you can see, we do operate in a very accepting environment, especially compared to Germany. And we had a protest outside the German embassy, for example, about Germany's treatment of Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. In terms of centering ourselves, well, the Jewish Board and the Zionist Federation take every opportunity to vilify any pro-Palestinian or anti-Israel activity as anti-Semitic. So we are home for Jews that are anti-Zionist, and we also are support base and an alternative Jewish voice within South Africa. and we're welcomed as that. We part of the South African BDS coalition. So we very much take direction from BNC, from organizations like Zuchrot and Adrid and grassroots organizations within Palestine. So I think we have a much easier environment, although we're much fewer. You know, in South Africa, there are only 70,000 Jews. And so it's a smaller community.
Okay. And so, Marilyn, you know, we have the question about, you know, centering ourselves as a Jewish movement as opposed to solidarity with Palestinians, but also how, in your context, this works with other movements for racial and social justice. And one of the questioners specifically asked about solidarity with the Maori people.
Well, we've been writing and saying since before Alternative Jewish Voices was formed that Aotearoa New Zealand has a voice to bring to this issue, and we're passing it up. We have acknowledged colonization. We have acknowledged it as an enduring legacy. And when we simply silently side with Israel, we miss our calling. We know that that progress is hard and uneven, and the only way to begin it is to begin. I think among the next generation of Palestinian speakers, that solidarity with Maori is much more fearlessly present. You know, at the rallies last May, you could hear it over and over, there is no peace on stolen land. It's great to see events becoming more bilingual and more bicultural. As for organizing conflicts and centering the Jewish community, an interesting thing is shifting here. Some time ago, we asked some Palestinian friends what else we should be doing, how to be better allies. And they were asking us to clear away another of the obstacles, to try to clear away another of the obstacles by standing in front of the widening, unearned accusations of anti-Semitism that deter Palestinian speech. And as we did that, and we saw these really widening sets of accusations being made by certain Zionist institutions, we realized that we were seeing a local project under the Zionist umbrella. We tried to understand its form by researching and writing about, I think, one of the most extreme Zionist institutions in our country. It's called the Israel Institute. In fact, it is a registered company with 3 directors, one Jewish, one Christian Zionist, and one neoliberal. His other public involvements include the Property Investors Association, the Libertarian Taxpayers Group. This is in fact a very conservative coalition operating on the public assumption that anything called an Israel Institute must be by and about the Jewish community, but it's not. So we want everyone on their target list, the labor unions, academics, anti-racists. We want them to understand their antagonist as a conservative entity that is seeking to divide and weaken its traditional local political opponents. In fact, they are decentering the Jewish community all by themselves by embarking on a domestic political project that uses anti-Semitism charges as a useful tool. So our hope is that as we shift this framing and people better understand, we will avert conflict and in fact be broadening our alliances.
All right, thanks, Marilyn. Just quickly to Brant, was there anything you wanted to throw in there before we go on to the next?
No, I think my colleagues covered that one very, very well, so we can move on.
Okay, great. So another question that Vilan threw out there, which I think would be very interesting for us to talk about, is miseducation and just kind of the the misapprehensions that people have about what it means to be Palestinian. And I've always felt in the United States that in the same way that everyone, including people that really don't know anything about Judaism, have somewhat positive feelings about Jewish culture, you know, whether they've seen Fiddler on the Roof or Seinfeld or whatever, there's this sense that being Jewish is kind of part of the culture, whereas Palestinians are seen as being very alien. So just wondered if you had any thoughts about the roles we can play in kind of averting this miseducation. And I'm reminded that actually we're kind of down to the wire, so we'll try to keep our answers kind of quick on this. But Rowan, what about you?
Yes, I'll be quick. I think lending our voice to Palestinians who are trying to do education work is obviously a crucial part of this. I also think it's worth just being very present, because at least for Ijcjp, we're one of the very few leftist Jewish organizations in Canada, especially on the national scale, but even on many local scales. And so whenever we speak at something, even if it's, you know, a pro-migrant rally or something that isn't directly related to the Palestinian cause, we make sure to say, you know, we're here, we're Jews, and we're also in solidarity with Palestinians, and start to just normalize that discourse as much as possible and make sure that it's always mentioned, even when that's not the topic at hand, is something important that we can do to really push in the public consciousness that there is a Jewish community and Jewish population that takes this position, and that maybe those kind of biases you mentioned need to be reconsidered and rethought.
Definitely, great. Wieland, any ideas from you?
Yeah, well, I think aside from this just general activism and what Rowan was describing in terms of presenting ourselves in solidarity, there's really, to me, also a battle of facts and history that has to be waged, because in Germany, it's almost hard to fathom, but for many people who are heard much too loudly, even the word Nakba is just a kind of propaganda. They say, oh yes, this is what Palestinians always say in order to delegitimize Israel. And they say, you know, Israel was established and then all the Arabs attacked it. You know, so then there are simple facts that can be used against this. You can say, okay, look, the ethnic cleansing started at the end of 1947. And, you know, it wasn't the case of people suddenly being attacked because they, you know, because they were Jews. And, you know, Ben-Gurion had been planning ethnic cleansing, you know, at least 10 years in advance, and all of these things, just to give a few basic facts. And of course, not everybody will want to accept that, depending on how ideologically indoctrinated they are. But I think it's just incredibly important, if we're talking about miseducation, to really counter that by just getting facts out in whatever medium possible, you know, whether it's social media or actually trying to get some sort of printed materials, or to somehow work with some organizations that do produce material informing people about racism, and to actually just get a few of these misconceptions debunked, because they are really what's perpetuating a lot of the hatred. People just saying, look, you know, since the very beginning, you Palestinians have been anti-Semites, basically.
Yeah. Rena, what about you?
I mean, I think it's very important. Obviously, in South Africa, people identify with the oppressed, but Christian Zionists are making headway into South Africa more and more, and we need to actually be more proactive about that.
Yeah, I think, thank you for mentioning that, because in the US as well, many people don't realize that AIPAC is largely funded more by Christian Zionists than just Jewish Zionists. Marilyn.
I recently had a conversation with a Palestinian parent who was shocked by what their children were casually told in school. So we also have a miseducation issue here, but I think we have a further one, and that is simply to normalize the fact that we have a Palestinian community. We don't need to keep talking about them. We can speak with them. We can invite them to be the speakers. So I think one of the clearest things that we can do and consistently do is simply refer to our Palestinian neighbors. It's not only an issue over there, it's about the rights we accord to each other here, to be full citizens.
Very true, very true. And I think I'll quickly give the last word to Brant.
Oh, yes, very quickly. Yeah, I just want to echo everything that's been said. I think we need to educate the world that Zionism does not equal Judaism and vice versa. And the simplest way we can do that is by standing up as Jews alongside Palestinians. The other thing I wanted to say is to underline something Velan said about the Nakba. I think Nakba education is enormously important. And in addition, not merely sort of the pedagogy of arguing with what actually happened in 1948 versus what didn't, but actually amplifying testimonies of Palestinians, so their stories of what they experienced during the Nakba. This isn't something we do as Jews with Holocaust education. The most powerful way to do that is through testimony of survivors. Last night, my wife Hallie and I watched a movie it was the closing night at the Chicago Palestine Film Festival, a feature film called Farha, which is a Palestinian movie about a young girl's experience during the Nakba. A movie like that is more powerful and more effective than any kind of pedagogical argument. There are documentaries, very important documentaries. There's a documentary about Tantura, a massacre that occurred during the Nakba there. So I think amplifying Palestinian stories of what they experienced during 48 is a very, very key part of this education.
All right. Well, I'm afraid that this time has gone far more quickly than I thought it would. I first just want to list the names of all of the organizations that are part of Ijcjp. Jewish Voice for Peace and Jews Say No in the United States, Independent Jewish Voices Canada, Boycott from Within, Israeli Citizens for BDS, South African Jews for Free Palestine, Jewish Voice for Labor in the UK, and Jewish Network for Palestine in the UK, Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in the Middle East in Germany, Alternative Jewish Voices in New Zealand, Jewish Call for Peace in Luxembourg, Jews Against the Occupation in Australia, the French Jewish Peace Union, Another Jewish Voice in Belgium, and Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in Ireland. And once again, I want to thank all 5 of our tremendous speakers for all their insight and for all the information. Roland Gadette in Canada, Rena King in South Africa, Velan Hulben in Germany, Marilyn Garson in New Zealand, and Brant Rosen here in the United States. So thank you to all of at one point we had 112 people on the call. I'm not sure exactly which countries, but from quite a number of countries. So clearly there is an appetite and a need for this kind of conversation. And we look forward to bringing you more such webinars in the future. So good morning, good night, good afternoon, wherever you are. And thanks so much for joining us. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. And thank you for your great facilitation, Leslie.